Welcome to the first of 4 webinars in September. This is an unusual series, but this is an unusual year. So over the next 4 Mondays, the most astute individuals will help us understand the unique moment and the threats facing our democracy. There are so many factors that have led us to a time in which the major party nominees for president and vice president have so starkly represented the divisions we face. One party's nominees represent the progress we have made and the promise of America. The other party's nominees inflame the anger and frustrations of those who feel left behind, belittled. They play on fears and the desire of those who want to go back to a time which was less confusing, more orderly, and where they felt their place in society was safe. There is a common denominator that both party nominees share, however. They both seek power. For one, power is a means to an end. For the other, power is the end. They don't want to govern, they want to rule. Those whose goal is to acquire and keep power have changed the rules, created false narratives, manipulated fears, assigned blame, and have chipped away decade after decade at our democracy. Today's panelists have a deep understanding of the strategies and tools used to weaken democratic institutions. Led by Tiffany Muller of End Citizens United, this discussion will be sobering but motivating. Before beginning the panel discussion, however, I want to introduce Erica Williams. She has been instrumental in designing and framing this entire series of webinars by PSG Consulting. Erica.
Thank you so much, Paige. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And hopefully for the next several Mondays, as Paige mentioned, this is a series that we are really excited to be inviting you all into. I think Paige did a terrific job of laying out the stakes of the moment, right? But when we say the moment, we're not just talking about these next 56 days. I would argue we're in a high stakes era of political history, right? And it requires a lot from us. By us, I mean those of us who care about not just democracy, but humanity, about people, about making this country what it can and should be, even though it has never actually been that. We believe in what's possible. I got my start almost 2 decades ago at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. And so I think a lot about our civil rights icons and legends and those who came before us and what they were tasked with holding all at once, right? There was the need to hold a fierce focus on the present, which I know we can identify now. Again, this next 56 days is critically important. But they were also tasked with holding a sober assessment of the past. What has worked? What hasn't worked? How we got here, right? And then the difficult part with holding both of those is the responsibility to also hold a really deliberate and bold, creative, and dare I say, hopeful view of the future. We jokingly say, can you walk and chew gum at the same time, as if that's easy? It is not easy to do all of these things at once. And yet we must. And what I've learned as I've been working with Paige and a wonderful group of advisors, some of whom are on this call in building, innovating for the public good, I've recognized that now is the perfect moment when in the right hands, with the right minds and the right shared vision, it's the perfect moment and the perfect conditions for innovation. Innovation is the instrument that we have to disrupt what is happening right now and make lasting change. And so that is ultimately what this series of conversations is going to be about. It's inviting, as Paige said, some of the brightest minds to be able to share their perspective on where we've been, where we are, how we get out of this mess, and how we build towards a better future for us all. And so as we are having the conversation today, led by Tiffany Muller with some other brilliant folks, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to submit comments or questions there. At the end, the team is going to be able to pull some of those and respond to them in real time. But more than anything, we want you to think critically, listen, and figure out how this conversation pertains to your work, what we are trying to all accomplish in this next 56 days and, again, beyond. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Tiffany for today's conversation on democracy.
Well, thank you so much, Erica. And it is such a pleasure to be here with such an esteemed group of panelists and colleagues and friends. And Paige, as always, thank you so much for bringing us all together for these critically important discussions. In President Obama's final speech in office, he said that if we want to keep our democracy, we need to address the structural attacks that we have been seeing undermine our democracy. And that included taking on the amount of money in politics, gerrymandering that we were seeing, and of course, the voting rights attacks that we had been seeing escalate. And we couldn't have even known at that point in 2016 what we were going to be faced with over the next 4 years, what we have continued to see over the last 4 years. And so this conversation couldn't come at a more critical time. As Erica said, we are 56 days out from the most important election of our lifetime. That is not just us saying that, that is voters who feel that as well. And they feel that because they understand that our very democracy is on the ballot. And so we have brought together an incredible group of panelists to have this conversation today. Maya Wiley, President and CEO of Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, Michael Waldman with the Brennan Center, and of course, Ben Scott, who's going to talk about disinformation. We're going to answer 3 basic questions. How did we get here? What can we do in the short term? And what can we do in the long term? And so before I turn it over to my esteemed colleagues, I just want to take a couple of minutes to say from a money and politics angle, how we got here started well before the Citizens United decision. But as our organization is End Citizens United, I will take a little bit of time to talk about what we've seen since the January 2010 Citizens United decision, which everybody who's watching, I'm sure knows, took 2 really terrible ideas and it merged them together and it said money equals speech and corporations are people. And it really let in just this unlimited flood of undisclosed money into our system. And you know, what it's done is it's actually changed the incentives for candidates and elected officials. It means that they care far more about pleasing their biggest donors or pleasing those that they think may go spend against them rather than pleasing their constituents and solving problems. We see it every single day in the gridlock and dysfunction in Washington, but you also see it when you have real blatant attacks on our democracy, like January 6th or like election denialism, and you see an entire party fall in line with an authoritarian wannabe dictator rather than actually standing up for the country. They do it because the money is there. They do it because they're scared. They do it because they want power, all of these reasons. You know what else we see? We see this money attacking all of our other freedoms. For example, in 2021, we saw the Heritage Foundation bragging about putting $42 million into pushing voter suppression bills across the country. We see it in the attacks on reproductive freedom, where we saw first $600 billion go into stacking the court with extremist MAGA majority, and then another $500 billion dedicated to overturning Dobbs. All of our rights, all of our freedoms, all of our democracy are connected. Voters get that, we all get that, and we know that for both the short term and the long term, our solutions also must be interconnected and comprehensive. And that's why in Citizens United, we focus on a couple of things. One, we focus on electing candidates who will vote the right way and who will make sure to protect our democracy and put that first and foremost. And we work with all of our amazing partners here to try to pass bills that will actually start to address the structural changes. Bills like the Freedom to Vote Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, the Native American Voting Rights Act, Disclose Act, ethics bills. And long term, we know that we have to overturn Citizens United, we have to reform the Supreme Court, and we have to give power back to the people because that's where it belongs. And so, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my incredible colleague, Maya Wiley.
Let me just start with saying the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights is the nation's oldest and largest civil rights coalition, and we look like America, and we are the majority of America in all ways, demographically, geographically, religiously, we're much of it, all the things. But I say that we're going to be 75 years old next year. And when you come out of the tradition of the civil rights movement, when you're founded in this, what we call the Second Reconstruction, I just want to say one thing about money in politics. Guess what the first corporation was in the United States? The Virginia colony. Guess what was utilized and when to start calling corporations people? the 14th Amendment of the United States of America, which was the critical Civil War amendment meant to create equal citizenship for Black people and all people in this country. And in other words, that we have and always have had the struggle of preventing, we've always had some autocracy in this country, and we should note that, know it, and know we've been fighting it for a very long time. But what we have seen is the continuation and building on a country that hasn't dealt with its original sins of racism, its original sins of sexism, its original sins of the way in which that also created classes, with so many left out. And that means that all of what Tiffany just said has a real deep basis in history, but it also means we have to know what we did to succeed, that we have always had less money, but what we have always had is the people. And as a civil rights coalition, we know that history, and that's how we won the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in the first place. 100 years is how long it took us from slavery, from the abolition of slavery, to get the right to vote. And as Tiffany points out, we have needed multiple things, but let's just understand that the attack on our fundamental rights to vote has always been a race wedge. The big lie is a very old lie, and we won't go back into the whole history of it. But if you start to remember what we started to see in 2008, when Barack Obama won that election, when we saw a record high turnout, and at the same time we were seeing demographic shifts in this country that were demonstrating that in many places there was not one dominant racial majority in the country. I'm saying all this to say the shenanigans, I will summarize them as shenanigans, the shenanigans around strict voting ID laws that were totally unnecessary, the lies about having to protect a perfectly valid election, was actually, in some instances, you even had state parties and electeds saying the quiet part out loud about keeping Black voters or Latino voters from the polls, suppressing the vote, making it harder, because they couldn't win or didn't believe they could win their votes. Fundamental to democracy is understanding what problems we're trying to solve and how to solve them, not vilifying other people and suggesting that their participation in our system is the problem. It's an old one, it's a long-standing one, but the solutions are exactly what they've always been, is working in coalition to pass what I call the package of voting rights laws. It's a package. Everything you heard Tiffany said just amounts to one thing: nationalizing the ability, the states to have the same baseline that protects people from the shenanigans. All people, every single one, doesn't matter what color you are, what your zip code is, you get the same protections. What we have seen because of the jerry-rigged Supreme Court, and then I'll wrap up because I'm saying too much, is that the jerry-rigged Supreme Court is exactly why in 2013, not 2016, 2013, we already had a problem with a court that was saying, rather than protecting fundamental rights, we'll start eroding them. The way we get that back is making sure our people know to show up, know what they're showing up for, and know and understand that they're going to have more power when they show up. That's what we're working on.
Wonderful. We're now going to hear from my dear friend, Michael Waldman at the Brennan Center.
Thank you so much, Tiffany, and thank you, Maya, for your powerful words. The Brennan Center, for those of you who don't know, is a nonpartisan law and policy institute. We work to strengthen, to reform, and when necessary, to defend the systems of democracy and justice in this country so they work for all. We do this work not, in our case, because of support for a party or a candidate, but because we care passionately about the country, about the Constitution, and about our democracy. We believe that we are in a great fight for the future of American democracy, nothing less, that the stakes are that high, and that for the first time in many years, the issue of democracy itself, the health of our democracy, is at the center of public debate and public conversation. In a way, for all the challenges and dangers that we face all together, that's actually the good news. That actually is the thing above all else that gives us hope. Maya is exactly right. These fights didn't start last week. They didn't start in 2008. they go back to the very beginning of the country. As we all know, the way in which race and class and gender and everything else is baked into our political system in a way that we have to overcome. And I always like to point out that John Adams, at the very beginning, not to wonk out too much on the history, was urged when he was writing the Massachusetts Constitution in 1776, he was urged to do what Ben Franklin had done in Pennsylvania and eliminate the property requirement for voting at a time when only white men who owned property could vote. And Adams was aghast by that idea. He said, if we do that, women will demand the right to vote. Lads of 18 will demand the right to vote, and people who hath not a farthing to their name will think themselves worthy of an equal voice in government, and they will demand the right to vote. John Adams said, there will be no end of it. And that, in a sense, is the story of America. In every generation, people have been demanding a seat at the table of democracy, demanding the opportunity to be heard, and other people who have something to lose have been fighting fiercely to hold on to what they have, to change the rules, to stop that democratic progress and expansion. We all know the ways in which that has played out, and it is exactly right that it's one of the things that is powerful about this moment and about the legislative and reform efforts that we're all part of, is these issues for far too long have been understood as distinct, somewhat technical categories. Voting rights over here, money in politics over there, redistricting over there. In fact, it's all seamlessly part of the same fight for democracy. It is the package, as Maya Wiley said. And we understood that at other times in our country's history. When corporations were newly formed and were buying and selling the state legislatures in the 20th century at the beginning, the answer that Americans came up with was the first federal campaign finance laws. Yes, the very laws that Citizens United struck down, but also the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, giving voters the right to vote for senator. People and our power has always been the answer at every step of the way to whatever ails our democracy. So it's a really big moment. It's a big deal that this is the first time this has been front and center. It was a really big deal that Vice President Harris, in her acceptance speech, pledged to sign bold democracy reform legislation. It is a really big deal that there is a chance that these measures could come to the floor quickly if their political stars align. So it's a big moment in this fight, and as ever, we're all part of it.
Thank you so much, Michael. Remember to drop your questions in the Q&A function, and we will get to them right after our next incredible speaker, Ben Scott.
Thank you very much, Ben Scott. And I run a global nonprofit called Reset Tech, which is relatively new. And we focus on another one of the pillars of democratic institutions that sits alongside those that my colleagues have so ably described. And this pillar is the relationship between media, technology, and democracy. Or if I can put it a little bit more colloquially, how do we know what we know? At the base of every democratic debate, at the bottom of every self-governing society is the public sphere. How do we talk to one another about the problems that we face? And how do we make decisions together about who represents us and how they represent the government and who wins and loses in the great arguments of our times? And the media has always played a fundamental role in that since the beginning of this American experiment. And in the last 25 years, what we've seen is a massive paradigm shift in the nature of how we consume information and who controls how we know what we know. And we moved from a 20th century model where newsrooms and journalists and editors were fundamental players in shaping what information we got as citizens to help us figure out what we needed to know in order to make decisions. That's now been completely fragmented into the internet. And the old public service duties, which admittedly many newsrooms didn't always follow, but at least had them as their anchor, all of those duties have sort of been cast over the side as we've moved into a digital media environment. And at first, it seemed that the fragmentation of the media system into this grand, glorious cacophony of the internet and social media was going to be a great thing for democracy, because it allowed lots of people to speak who had been previously shut out of the mainstream media. It created opportunities for people to find one another with like minds and views. But it soon became clear that this public service motive of helping people to find credible information that the news media had provided for decades and decades was being replaced by a business model that values attention. It captures attention and sells it to advertisers. And as a result, the world of YouTube and Twitter and Facebook has moved aside the public service values of news and information and has substituted that which gets the most eyeballs is the best content. And as a result, over time, the frequency with which we see things on social media has become a substitute for accuracy and reason as a marker of credibility. What do I mean by a marker of credibility? I mean what most of the people most of the time accept to be true and reasonable. And as we move into the digital media market of the 21st century, that is increasingly dominated by technology companies and not by journalism or the ethic of professional journalism, what we have is volatility. What we have is a chaos of conspiracy and extremism. And we have a business model at the root of it that monetizes and privileges that which is extreme. And in this environment, it becomes vulnerable. It becomes vulnerable to those political candidates who are gifted at demagoguery, who are unscrupulous about the spread of lies and conspiracies to manipulate people. It becomes vulnerable to our foreign adversaries, as we've just seen with the Department of Justice's revelations last week, that a major Russian information operation has co-opted a significant number of right-wing influencers on social media. And ultimately, it persuades people that you can't believe anything. And in that environment, it becomes very difficult to manage a public sphere that is meant to be fact-based, that is meant to be reason-based, that is meant to help guide our decisions as a public, to help solve critical questions like voting rights, to help solve critical problems like racial injustice, to solve critical problems like money in politics. And what we see now as we head into the thick of this campaign season is perhaps the most extreme version we have witnessed yet of the exploitation of the digital media marketplace to the detriment of democracy. And this is something that we have to address in the campaign season, where we have to work with vulnerable communities to help identify where are these conspiratorial narratives coming from? Why are they being targeted at my community? How can I find credible information? How can I participate as a voter and come informed to the ballot box? But once the election is over and a new government is formed, it is critical that we think of this as one of the grand policy challenges of our time. We have to realign the businesses and the incentives in the digital media marketplace with the values of our democracy. Because if we don't, we will simply experience more volatility, more chaos, and more of the rule of the irrational and the conspiratorial in our politics. And ultimately, it becomes very difficult to see how democracy is sustainable in that environment. A bleak prospect, but one for which I still have hope that we can correct.
Thank you so much, Ben. We are going to move into Q&A now. And also, I want to say, I think all of us as panelists probably had a little bit of downness in our remarks, but also all of us have great hope about what is possible when people stand together and when people join together in this fight. And it's why I'm so happy to be in this fight with all these incredible colleagues that you just heard from. So we are going to go to some Q&A now. I am just waiting for the first question to pop up. And please drop your questions in the chat if you want. The first question's from Sharon. The Electoral College is the stumbling block for Democrats every 4 years. If we cannot get rid of it, as we should, an overwhelming victory is the only solution I see. How do we make that happen? And let's start with actually Michael first, and then we'll kick it around.
Well, I'll talk a little about the Electoral College. And again, just from the perspective of the Brennan Center, we're a nonpartisan organization. And so I'll leave to others their thoughts on how the Democrats should do. The Electoral College is one of those aspects of American democracy that bake in a highly dysfunctional and increasingly dangerous minority veto on our politics. There's a lot of things that are in our constitutional system or in our political system that, they kind of were okay for a while. The Senate, gerrymandering, the Electoral College followed the popular vote in every election from the late 1800s till the year 2000. But we all know that twice it has given the loser in the popular vote the presidency. Arguably, it almost happened again in 2020. And while it generally has lately favored the Republicans, in 2004, John Kerry would have become president if a few thousand votes had switched in Ohio, even though George W. Bush handily won the popular vote. This is not a way to run a railroad. It is not a way to have a working political system with credibility. And I will note one of the consequences of this, one party, the Democrats, have won the popular vote in 7 out of the last 8 presidential elections, and that is the longest winning streak in American political history in that measure. But the other political party, the Republicans, have appointed 6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices to lifetime terms, another baked-in minority veto point. So there are ways to deal with the Electoral College. There's a constitutional amendment. There's the National Popular Vote Compact, which would make it a kind of a vestigial organ where states would pledge to cast their electors for whoever wins the national popular vote. But it is the case that as a political matter, in recent elections, Democrats have needed to win a hefty majority in the popular vote and then eke out smaller wins in the swing states.
Thank you, Michael. Maya, let's take the second part of the question, which is how do we score an overwhelming victory?
We organize, we organize, we organize. Look, that's what we've always done. That's how we've always won change. And it's what we're still needing to do and still doing. But let me say a little bit more about that, because the question about the Electoral College from Sheridan is absolutely right in terms of its importance. We are also nonpartisan. We do lobby as the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, but we don't tell people who to vote for. We do work on how to turn people out, and to Ben's point, we work on identifying, pre-bunking, and also debunking mis and disinformation, because it's usually targeted against people of color to try to suppress their votes. That's a dominant way, whether it's domestic or foreign. But I will say this, we have to win DC statehood. We should absolutely focus on how we get more people. We have very low turnout rates relative to the rest of the world that has free and fair elections. That's because we do not do enough to make it easy, accessible, and to ensure that people know what their power is. When we do that, particularly where we see this voter suppressive activity, that's also where we get the power both in state legislatures as well as, and when I say power, I'm talking about power for what I will call a civil rights coalition of governance that ensures that we are advancing all our rights, not undermining them. That's not about party. We've had bipartisanship on these issues in the past. But it is about making sure that voters have power. And if voters don't have power, we can't address any of this, which is why it's job one. And just back to your point about hope, this isn't hope is not just about blind trying to win something that can't be won. This is winnable. We were 2 votes shy in 2021, 2 votes in the Senate. All that means is a few more people show up to vote in key states, in all states, my hope. We actually have the majority of the people who will push and get this done.
All right. Next question is from Frank Sanchez. And Frank asked, his question's about Latino voting behavior during this election period and what we're seeing. So I'm going to actually go back to you first, Maya. And then, Ben, I'm going to come over to you.
So we're seeing a couple of things. We're seeing energy. We're seeing actually a lot of folks organizing to get the vote out, get people registered, get the vote out. We're also seeing all the same voter suppressive activities, like in Texas, where a very political partisan state attorney general is actively working to use the power of the attorney general's office to make people fearful about helping people vote. It is egregious. We as the Civil Rights Coalition are organizing to support Latino community in Texas, but it's exactly the kind of shenanigans we're talking about when we're talking about why we are working on these voting rights package of bills. But the other thing is the disinformation is often targeting Latino community. It's often Spanish language. So one of the things we have to make sure happens is that there's enough work being done, which there is by some incredible Latino-led organizations around the country. I just want to say that. Hispanic Federation, LULAC, a bunch of others, Unidos. But I will also say this. It's incumbent upon all of us not to believe the disinformation about the Latino community either. Because when we allow that kind of division, that is a problem for democracy, and we won't have it.
Well, and Ben, that's a great segue to you. What kind of disinformation are we seeing in the Latino community?
So the point that Maya makes is exactly right, which is that because everybody understands the criticality of the Latino vote in this election, they are unfortunately the target of a great deal of conspiratorial disinformation. And one of the major tactics that we see from the right is an attempt to divide older Latinos from younger Latinos by demonizing younger migrants and refugees who have come across the border, and to characterize them as some sort of invasion force. You hear Donald Trump talking constantly about an invading army and jails emptying out and mental asylums. This is a dehumanizing, preposterous narrative that has been bombarded at so many communities for such a long period of time that it begins to sink in, and people have the sense, well, there must be something to it. This is an incredibly dangerous kind of narrative because it takes on a life of its own, and it's incredibly important that we are constantly vigilant and we're speaking out against it. I think it's also important to point out that the big technology companies have been incredibly irresponsible in this space, insofar as they allow a lot of these dehumanizing, incitements to violence to flow on their networks without any kind of attempts to put safety standards in place. And when they do intervene and they pull down or they label particular conspiracy theories, they do it in English but not in Spanish. And the same content that they're restricting in English is all over the place in Spanish. This kind of basic public safety and consumer standards are a critical part of what the public should demand from these companies, so that our elections have a chance of being safe and secure, and that people can go to the polls without fear of violence. People can go to the polls without fear of being arrested, and we can all exercise our right to vote equally.
Thank you so much, Ben. All right, we have the last audience question, and it's from Karen Mulhauser. And Karen asks, and I hope I pronounced that right, what are the issues that are best to turn out infrequent Democratic voters? And Maya's jumping at the chance to ask this one. She is begging me to give it to her. So Maya, we'll start with you. But since this is the last question, I will actually give everyone a chance to answer. But Maya, let's start with you.
So look, nobody votes if they're not hearing their issues that are impacting their daily lives. And we've done actually a lot of research, have a lot of our member groups have groups on the ground. It's very simple. We got to talk about improving schools. We got to talk about criminal justice reform, and of course, abortion, healthcare. While we know economy is always a top issue for voters. It always is. But for the voters that need to turn out, who are so often registered to vote but don't necessarily show up every election cycle, these are the voters that we need to ensure they understand what difference it makes when they show up. And let me just say this one thing, because if you say one thing to folks you're trying to help get out, this will be very important to say. Not only is it about what you care about is happening in your schools, whether your books are being banned or not, whether your kids are able to learn their history or not, whether their teachers are able to deliver what they're supposed to deliver, whether we have criminal justice reform, all the things that matter so much to voters. But here's the other thing. I ran for office, and I'm going to tell you exactly what happens when you don't show up to vote. Politicians don't show up to your community. So the act of actually showing up to vote itself gives you more power, because then they have to come talk to you. We have to tell voters this more because it's not taught in schools. And that is about shaping how they will have more power. I've seen it work. We've got to talk about power.
All right, let's go over to Ben.
A very important question. How do we get people out to vote? I +1 to all the things that Maya said. You know, the data that I have looked at suggests that really important for people to understand that this election is not about freedom from what the government might do to me. It's freedom to have the things the government can help me to take advantage of. So, you know, this is not an election about the protections against government intervention. This is an election about having an opportunity to vote freely and fairly. It's about having the opportunity to have free choice of reproductive rights. It's about having an opportunity to get a good job and move up the social and economic ladder. It's about having an opportunity to get an affordable education. It's about having an opportunity to buy a home or to take a loan out on a car. These are all things that require a state that's looking after people from the middle out and from the bottom up, and not simply giving tax breaks to the upper crust, and looking to turn our nation's capital into a klepto state. So it seems to me a relatively straightforward question, but obviously one that is imperative for us all to be answering every day as often as possible, because how we know what we know ultimately comes down to not only what we see in the media, but what we hear from our friends, our family, and our colleagues in conversations just like this one.
Michael, what do you have to say?
I would say a few things. One is that all candidates on all sides really need to tell voters what they want to have happen. Donald Trump has made it very clear what his policy agenda is should he win a term. They handed out signs at the Republican convention saying mass deportation now. That is not exactly beautiful poetry, in my view. Vice President Harris, who of course has entered the race so recently, has, I think, a continued responsibility to talk more about what she would do and what therefore people would see as benefit to them. And I think we will probably hear that kind of thing in the debate, but going forward as well. I think it's entirely necessary. Voters often know what the problems are. They're skeptical that voting will matter. They say, why vote? It only encourages them. If they think they have not just an urgent need to have change, but that voting might actually cause the change to happen, that can really make a big difference. The other thing I'll say is this. The question asked about low propensity voters, people who might not usually vote. Those are the people who are targeted in a very specific and I would say malicious way by so many of the voter suppression measures that we see. It was mentioned earlier that in 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, the most effective civil rights law, in the Shelby County case. The Brennan Center, in our studies on the racial turnout gap, showed that since 2008, the turnout level between white voters and non-white voters has expanded, has grown. The gap has grown all over the country. It suggests it's for many reasons, not just bad voting laws in one place or another, but that the turnout gap grew at twice the rate in the states that used to be covered by the Voting Rights Act in its full strength before the Supreme Court gutted it. Who are those voters? It's the newer voters. It's the younger voters. It's the voters who don't have a history of voting, who don't know in their bones the struggles and sacrifices that it took to get to the ballot box. So I think we need to do everything we can to stop these voter suppression measures this year, to make sure that votes get counted, to make sure that election officials are not facing violence and assault, and that the lies about our elections, about non-citizen voting and every other nonsense that we're hearing, that we're loud and clear in rebutting that. That's the best way to ensure that those low propensity voters become lifetime voters with a tradition of participation.
Yeah, and I will just add on to that, we know that if we can establish a voting record, that people do get into the habit of voting. And so, but we also know that right now, too many people feel like government isn't working for them. Their lives are getting harder and harder. And just nobody here in Washington cares about what's happening in their life. And so to Maya's point and Michael's point and Ben's point, they just don't feel like their vote has any power, and they sure don't feel like it's going to help influence any policy decisions. And to be able to change that, we have to both tell them why their vote has power and to show them how it helps hold elected officials accountable. And we have to deliver. When they do show up and vote, when we have the votes, when we have the governing power, we have to deliver on that mandate for change. We have to help ensure that there is some hope given back to people, that actually government can care about and do something about the issues that are pressing on their lives on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so here's the fun thing. We have a bit of time for the panelists to ask each other questions, which just feels like I just get to ask my friends like the questions that I always have on my mind. So I'm gonna take the moderator privilege and start. All right, so Maya, I'll start with you. All right, I get asked a lot about what changed from 2006, the last time we reauthorized the Voting Rights Act, it was 2006, right?
Mm-hmm.
On a
Yes, it was.
Yes, it was.
And we had a bipartisan support for the bill, as we had every reauthorization since 1965, until later.
And it was 98-0 in the Senate, I believe. And that is probably the question I get asked more than anything, is to try to help people understand why has it changed so much from 2006 to now. So please.
Y'all. So we just have to do some truth telling right now. We have seen both demographically in terms of younger voters and in voters of color, and I mean that broadly, not a single racial category, as also white voters are aging out, that frankly, there are some folks that started looking at the electoral map and looking at voter behavior, in other words, who voters were voting for, and instead of trying to win their votes, started to control whether or not they could vote. And I don't, this is why we see, as Ben was talking about, the wedging with the mis and disinformation, who's targeted and how they're targeted. Why is it mostly communities of color and young people? Why do we want to eliminate polling sites from college campuses? It's actually about voter behavior, and instead of having what we would traditionally have in politics. And in fact, remember, there was a time in this country where most black voters voted for Republicans. It shifted. Why did it shift? It was the civil rights issues and who was carrying them. It wasn't what party it was, it was what the issues were. And that's the way democracy is supposed to work. And rather than working that way, we saw some crass politics happening that was not about winning over people, but winning despite people. I have a question. Can I ask a question, Ben?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so Ben, my spirit animal, Ben. So we have been doing a lot of work on disinformation and really trying to hold the big social media platforms accountable, both to their policies, trying to improve their policies and their content moderation. That used to be better until they got more afraid of right-wing conservative narratives about them being biased. But do you have any suggestions about how we collectively as a people assert more over them around what they're doing in terms of content moderation and disinformation?
So you're absolutely right that the biggest companies in Silicon Valley, who are, by the way, some of the richest companies in the history of the world, these guys are made of money, and yet they won't spend a dime to protect public safety and integrity and election integrity in America. And that is because they are afraid of the power of a resentful, vindictive Trump administration, or they have become a part of that MAGA conspiracy. So you have some companies, and I'd put Google and Meta in this bucket, which have simply decided that it's not good business to look after public safety and election integrity. And you have companies like Twitter with Elon Musk who decided to become a pernicious part of the problem. And I think that it's really important that we continue to help people understand that what they see in their phone is not a reflection of reality. It is a funhouse mirror that is cooked up for them to sell their attention to advertisers. And that the people who run those systems, they don't care whether or not they're pushing hate and resentment and fear and anxiety. They don't care that you can no longer find credible information, or that you're poisoning children with mental health issues, or that you're sending voters back home because they're afraid to go vote. They're looking to maximize the bottom line. So I think, number one, we need to help people understand that just like cigarette companies and polluters in the oil and gas industry, this is not a public service friendly industry, and that we need to act as consumers with our feet and go find alternative products and services. And when they have monopolies, we need to ask our government to intervene and set down some safety standards. It should not be the case that on all of our major social media platforms, the Kremlin is pushing information operations that are reaching tens of millions of people, and that the owner of Twitter is one of its most significant amplifiers. This is an upside down situation, and one that we shouldn't tolerate as a government. We would never tolerate it if the Kremlin was pushing an hour a day of content on NBC or CBS. Why do we tolerate it on Twitter and Facebook? I think that's a question of public will that becomes an answer of political will in the future. And it's an election issue that we ought to be talking about.
I think that was a great question, a great answer. And I think that actually it ties back to kind of the first conversation we were having too, about how the money that these businesses are putting out and the amount of lobbying that they're doing, the capture of our public agencies are hurting us in our day-to-day lives. And it's just so that they can get more profit and line their pockets. And we have to use every tool available at our disposal to be able to hold them accountable and make sure we're protecting the public good. Michael had to hop off, so he had another news hit he had to do. So I want to thank him so much for joining us. I want to thank Ben and thank Maya for being on this incredible panel, and thank Erica and Paige for having us. And I am now going to hand it back over to Erica.
Tiffany, thank you so much for leading us in such a rich discussion. And of course, I echo my thanks to Maya and to Michael and to Ben. This was thoughtful. This was thought-provoking. What I heard was that this is a singular fight. As much as we like to silo our issues, this is truly a singular fight. What I heard is that so many of the fundamentals from the other side, or as Maya put it, the people who were doing the shenanigans, so many of the fundamentals of their playbook are not new. And they are not rocket science, right? Harmful, dehumanizing narratives, othering, misinformation. But what I also heard is that people, and making sure that people know and understand their power and how to wield it as consumers, as voters, as participants in the system, has always been the answer, and it still is. This series today and the rest of the Mondays of this month is really all about the critical issues facing our democracy and the solutions that exist. And that is what excites me so much about these conversations, like the one we just heard and like the ones that we're going to be having the remainder of the month. is that they are a reminder of no matter how big and how intractable these problems feel, they are absolutely solvable. And our task, as we mentioned in the beginning, is to hold both past, present, and future in our hands, address these problems innovatively, and remembering that the people that we serve, the people that we are, our communities, the diversity of them, the depth of them, the breadth of them, is where our power actually lies. And so, again, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Paige, for convening us. And I'm going to toss back over to you, Paige, just to wrap us up.
Yes, I want to echo the thanks. This was a really fascinating discussion, and it shows that agreeing with Tiffany, this election is so important if we want to continue to have a functioning democracy. But this is a fight for the long term, just as they have been at this for decades to ensure that their interests are safeguarded. This is our work for the next decades, because if we don't do the hard work of addressing civil rights, addressing human rights, addressing money in politics, addressing misinformation over the long term, we're going to be a country that we don't recognize anymore. So that's motivating, and we're all in to make sure that we continue to have a robust conversation about how to strengthen America and its democratic institutions. So thank you all.